Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at the Serverless PDX meetup, and we just had a fireside chat with Google's Kelsey Hightower and Nate Taggart, CEO at Stackery. And you guys covered a lot of ground here. Nate, I'm curious on, kind of what you were really trying to learn from Kelsey here, because we're right on the verge of OSCON. There's a lot of discussion here that will be about serverless technologies, but there'll be a lot of other topics presented too. But in the context of kind of where we are in this market right now, and how you see serverless technologies emerging, what were you trying to learn from Kelsey here? What were some of the things that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, so, I think serverless is kind of high in the hype cycle right now. We're at kind of like peak mania over the potential. It's always a panacea. And so, one of the things that I really appreciate about Kelsey's perspective and how he adds to this conversation is both his expertise with containers, which I think can seem a little counter to the serverless movement, and also just his maturity in the view of the infrastructure market. This feels new. This technology feels very exciting, and in reality, it's maybe a new version of the same old thing that we do. This cycle that we go through of abstract away and then take back control, and then abstract away and take back control. So Kelsey adds a lot of dimension to that conversation.
Can I talk about what I learned?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, no, honestly, I think Nate represents and Stackery represents this company that's coming in and saying infrastructure is headed in the right direction, because it is, and laser focus on the things we can do above. So when he talks about the developer experience, I think that is becoming the center of focus for anyone, even in the platform world. When I engage with developers, they want an experience. And right now, serverless has gotten to a situation where you can start to build an experience on these known targets. I think serverless provides a known target where Kubernetes is getting close, but serverless really has that foundation down packed, in my opinion. So the workflows that they bring to the table are very interesting to me in the terms of like, why are we not doing that for Kubernetes? Why are we not doing that for some of our database products? So I think some of the stuff that they get to focus on, if you listen well enough, you know that those patterns could be applied in more places. It's just that there's just too loose of infrastructure underneath.
Yeah.
So what's that approach? What is that approach that you guys are taking with, building, that Kelsey's referring to?
Yeah, so for us, we tend to focus on what we see as kind of the skills gaps, and a lot of this comes down to the integrations. It's the connecting points. So it's easy enough to say, we're going to run a Kubernetes cluster so that we can scale our compute. That's not a terrible problem. It's but then how do we connect that compute to databases, to message streams and queues? How do we standardize it, normalize it, so that any engineer in our company can take it off the shelf and just apply that to their problem? And self-hosted, self-managed infrastructure, I don't know if it typically reaches that maturity. It does with certain expert companies. But cloud infrastructure, the nature of it is that's what it is. It's productized. And so it's very, very standardized, very, very consistent and predictable. What we try to focus on is then how do you pull the pieces together and assemble that into a cohesive whole, and try to sit at that intersection.
So one of the things you're interested in talking about is how, I'll back up a little bit. I interviewed the CTO at the New York Times, and he's a real advocate of Google's approach to serverless. And when I talked with him, he talked about CDNs, and he talked about his history with CDNs and how that was so important for him to think about automation, how to think about resource-driven automation. And one of the things he talks about is like a CDN, it basically was a serverless architecture, right? And so we're seeing this resource-driven automation, kind of continue to be here and continue to kind of circle back kind of in how we think about serverless technologies. But he draws a distinction between what we think of as function as a service versus serverless, and again, there's a lot of kind of obfuscation there, And so as you're trying to explain and trying to educate, how are you trying to distinguish between these terms, between serverless, and function as a service? Because there's a lot of kind of overlap.
Yeah, so I think CDN is a great use case where we need data to be accessible quickly to everyone around the world. And caching was one way of thinking about that. But once the caching pattern became kind of robust and well understood, then I think you start to see a whole market come around that. And the work you need to do to cache data globally is so well defined that you could just point some tool at the data and it will be taken care of for you. Compute is ripe for this, right? It's very loosely defined now, all these VMs or even containers for most part. I think serverless is an attempt, one part of serverless, this whole fully managed compute platform, if you decouple the event piece, is attempting to try to do something very similar. What if we said that you can give me some code and I will run it anywhere in the world and deal with any of the challenges? Like in a CDN, no one thinks about scale in a CDN. If someone pulls that content in Australia for the first time, it's going to be able to run the sequential pulls later, and that's handled for you by someone with infrastructure everywhere. On the compute side, cloud providers happen to have infrastructure everywhere, where you don't, and this is why people started to go to a CDN. No way they were going to build infrastructure everywhere. And now you're starting to see infrastructure everywhere on the compute side. You can almost do CDN for compute, the way we replicate that code.
You know, it's just an extension of this automation. Nobody's sitting there moving your files to the Australian CDN.
That's right.
So we've identified that there are certain patterns, and when they happen, we know how to react to that, and we automate that. This is what software is all about. I think we're starting to do that with compute in the serverless space. We have this idea of managing away, through software, through automation, some of the repeatable tasks that go along with managing infrastructure. Some scaling, some orchestration, some provisioning needs. And, you know, I could see that trend continuing, but it also comes along with, you know, giving up some control and turning some of that over to the cloud provider. So there's a balance here.
And here's where it gets scary too, though, because you guys were talking about this role of state, right? You know, and how you think about state. And, you know, all your state is in a database. You don't want to lose access to that, right? You don't want to have, and so like, it seems to be like one of the biggest impacts this may have is on the database world, right? And how you think about databases and how you think about, for instance, a Redis type database versus another database that might not have that same kind of capability to be replicated so easily. It seems like what you were getting at a little bit, you both were getting at a little bit in what you're talking about.
So I think in the future, databases will look and feel like CDNs, right? Think about a storage management layer that has different access patterns. For videos, they're kind of a blob and we can stream them, so they're easier to replicate. The query for a video is get this video and I can watch it and you watch the client. But when you start to talk about SQL structured data, imagine a global database, and at some point you'll start to have these data services that will automatically partition the data. This is the aims of something like Google's Cloud Spanner, which attempts to turn a relational model into something that feels a lot like a CDN. And I think you're going to start to see databases go that route. So then you start to think of, hey, there's some endpoint that if I ask it for data, it will feel like dealing with the CDN going forward. And I think that's where you're going to get into this new model. We couldn't do that necessarily with like deploy this database binary right there using that one file. Well, what happens if that compute is everywhere and the data is replicated for you automatically? It's just an access pattern.
In some ways, though, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Kelsey, but in some ways, not being able to depend on state as a byproduct of your compute is actually a best practice. We should be building systems like this. This is increasing resiliency. This is the right data pattern. Do you think serverless is actually going to force our hand to improve in some of this?
Yeah, I mean, all credit to Heroku. When they made that 12-factor manifesto, they really taught people how to think about these systems. Amazon coming out with EC2 early on, and it was like, look, these things are ephemeral. You need to put your data somewhere that is not. And I think that pattern started to become easier to adopt. People didn't understand it at first because there is some overhead. Luckily, caches can reduce some of that burden. But now that we start to see this pattern, you're right. For most people at the scale that they run at, you should totally separate your state and serverless. Like this should, or in your execute. This is just a thing we've always did, even with the LAMP stack. You put your data in Postgres, you put your application over here, and you put a web server in front. You split the two, happy times, right?
Yeah, happy times. Happy times, good old happy times. So like, so then you were, in some of your final kind of discussions, you were talking about use cases, right? And the use cases for serverless. One of the interesting things from our point of view, at least, is how we're starting to see this rise of server-side technologies and server-side approaches. And you were kind of discussing this a bit in context, where your phone will shut down if you try to overload it, right? If you try to like do too much on it, which it doesn't matter. Doesn't essentially matter in a server-side environment. And we've seen this server-side story really emerge, with the popularity of Node.js, for example, which is a clear example of that. But there's also, we're starting to see kind of this emergence of how you think of serverless technologies kind of in the context of almost building out these very kind of like this way to like separate tasks, to separate kind of tasks that have always usually been bound. For example, in my world, it may be, for instance, to cleaning up some data, right? Using a serverless technology, but then deploying it to a static site, to an example. And there's all kinds of use cases all over the place. I mean, all kinds of examples of how serverless technologies can be used to server side. But I'm curious about your kind of thinking about this intersection.
So I think serverless is a good temporary label to put on the goal. The goal is, as a developer, I want to compute wherever I want with less friction as possible. One pattern is this functions and events. That's one pattern. But I think people ultimately want that SaaS model that I think you described. I have this podcast. It will be really nice if you could edit it for me. I'm going to give you the podcast. You know my style. You know the sound levels I want. You know I don't want any cuss words in it. Take out the silence. Those are my preferences. I upload it, and you automate the editing process, and you give me back something that's like, wow, that's great. You could call that serverless editing, but it's really about workflow. So the progression, once we start talking about infrastructure, when we're done with that, then you're talking about like Salesforce and GitHub, hosted and managed Git repositories. There is no infrastructure. You just say GitHub. How many people talk about the Git server? So I think that is a world that we're trying to enable for even the custom software you write. And I think serverless platforms today are attempting to give you that SaaS-like model, even for your custom one-off code.
So I like to think about it in the use cases, kind of frame them in terms of what does serverless bring to the table that's maybe unique, right? So if you have a workload that's very unpredictable, very bursty, you're spending a lot of effort managing scale, don't outsource. You get a big ROI from that. It's not because of the cost of serverless, it's because of the labor of managing the system, right? Or you have workloads that are very, very infrequent. Once every 24 hours, you want to run a little task. Don't run a server all day long for that. And so in these ways, I think we tend, when we talk about serverless as a community, we tend to focus on the most interesting use cases. Oh, we can react to anything that changes in a database. We'll just react to it. Oh, we can build these really cool pipelines and manage it. And it's like, no. What's cool about serverless is that it's plug and play on things that used to be kind of a hassle. And so as we introduce more and more abstraction, and by the way, I think what we call serverless today, it's going to change, it's going to emerge. I think all the public cloud serverless offerings are limited to relatively low memory, relatively low disk space, relatively low runtime. I think the parameters will spread, but the bottom line is it's really not about how much memory you have, or it's really about why serverless? What advantage is that unlocking for you in your project?
And I think I like to watch the old IBM commercials that talk about mainframe. And I'm a fan, even though people hate on mainframe. It was, to me, the ultimate serverless experience. You're doing census data, you got some data, you load it up, done. No monitoring, Nagios, tracing, Prometheus, cloud native, nothing. Data in, data out. Highly reliable.
I haven't, yeah. I reminded of a story that a friend of mine told me, a friend of ours, and he was in his 70s or 80s, he recently passed away. And he was in Portland and was very involved in local politics back in the early 70s. But he worked on mainframes. And he was able to kind of figure out for the Democrats